Nobody in this town knew who he really was. To them, he was just the quiet mechanic. But that was about to change.
Every week, the same thing happened. And every week, the boy came home a little quieter, a little smaller.
What the instructor didn't know was that the mechanic sitting quietly in that garage every day used to move through war zones without making a sound. He had buried that part of his life years ago. But some things, you don't forget how to be.
Nobody in Millbrook ever looked twice at Marcus Reed. He fixed transmissions at the corner garage, paid his bills on time, kept his lawn neat, and picked his son up from karate class every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 5:15. If you asked anyone in town what they knew about him, they'd shrug and say he was quiet, maybe a little too quiet, and that his wife had passed 3 years ago, leaving him to raise his 9-year-old son Ethan alone. What none of them knew, what nobody in that small town had any reason to suspect, was that the soft-spoken mechanic in the gray jumpsuit had once served 11 years as a Navy SEAL, had led men through some of the most dangerous missions of his generation, and had buried that entire identity the day he decided his son needed a father more than the world needed a warrior. If this story pulls at something in you, stick around until the end, because what happens in this small-town dojo is going to remind you why quiet men are sometimes the most dangerous ones in the room. And if you believe in fathers who protect their children no matter the cost, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like this one are just getting started. It started 3 months earlier, when Ethan begged his father to sign him up for karate. He'd seen an ad for Cole's Elite Martial Arts Academy on the local Access channel, a flashy commercial featuring the owner, Derek Cole, a broad-shouldered former regional tournament champion with a shelf full of trophies and a reputation that stretched 2 counties wide. Derek Cole was, by every outward measure, a local celebrity. He'd been on the morning news twice, he sponsored the high school wrestling team, and his dojo walls were covered in photographs of him shaking hands with minor celebrities and local politicians. Marcus didn't know much about martial arts culture, but he knew his son needed something. Ethan had always been small for his age, shy, prone to hiding behind his father's leg at birthday parties. Since his mother's death, he'd grown even quieter, folding into himself in ways that worried Marcus more than he ever let on. So when Ethan asked, wide-eyed and hopeful, if he could learn karate like the kids in the commercial, Marcus said yes without hesitation. The first few weeks were fine. Ethan came home tired but smiling, proudly showing off the stances he'd learned, practicing his punches in the kitchen while dinner cooked on the stove. Marcus watched from the doorway some evenings, quietly proud, thinking that maybe this was exactly what his son needed. But slowly, the smiles started fading. Ethan would come home and go straight to his room. He'd pick at his dinner instead of finishing it. One evening, Marcus noticed a yellowish bruise blooming across his son's forearm, and when he asked about it, Ethan mumbled something about sparring practice and changed the subject. Marcus let it go, telling himself that bruises were part of learning a physical sport. But the following week, he noticed something else. Ethan had started flinching whenever Marcus raised his hand to ruffle his hair, a reflex that hadn't been there before. Marcus began paying closer attention. He started arriving a few minutes early to pick Ethan up, standing near the back of the dojo where the parents waited, watching class through the wide front windows. What he saw made something cold settle in his chest. Derek Cole ran his classes like a drill sergeant, with none of the discipline and all of the cruelty. He singled out the smaller, quieter kids, Ethan chief among them, mocking their form in front of the entire class, calling them weak, telling them they'd never amount to anything if they couldn't take a hit without crying. During partner sparring drills, Cole would pair Ethan with older, bigger students and stand back with his arms crossed, a faint smile on his face as the smaller boy struggled to defend himself. When Ethan finally broke down in tears one evening after a particularly rough sparring session, Cole loomed over him and told him, in front of the entire class, that champions didn't cry, and that if he wanted to keep training here, he'd better toughen up fast. Marcus watched all of this from the back of the room, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Every instinct honed over 11 years of combat told him to walk across that mat and put a stop to it right then and there. But he held himself back. He knew men like Derek Cole. He'd met plenty of them in his old life, men who thrived on power over people weaker than themselves, who mistook cruelty for discipline and intimidation for leadership. Confronting Cole in the moment, in front of his students and the other parents, would only humiliate Ethan further and give Cole an excuse to frame Marcus as the aggressor. So instead, Marcus drove home in silence that night, and after Ethan had gone to bed, he sat alone at his kitchen table and made a decision. He walked down to the basement, to a locked storage closet he hadn't opened in years, and pulled out an old military duffel bag covered in a thin layer of dust. Inside were things he hadn't looked at since he left the service: his old dog tags, a folded flag, a worn leather journal, and a small velvet box containing the trident pin that marked him as a United States Navy SEAL. He sat there for a long time, turning the pin over in his fingers, remembering the missions, the brothers he'd served beside, the version of himself he'd left behind when he chose to become nothing more than a quiet, small-town mechanic so that his son could grow up in peace. He hadn't planned on ever needing that part of himself again. But watching his son shrink under the cruelty of a man who mistook bullying for coaching had changed something in him. He wasn't going to raise a hand against Derek Cole. That wasn't who he was, and it wasn't the lesson he wanted his son to learn. But he was going to do something Cole would understand in a language of his own: respect, earned the hard way, on the mat, in front of everyone who had ever watched Cole humiliate a child. The following week, Marcus learned that Cole's dojo was hosting a regional exhibition event, a semi-public showcase where Cole liked to demonstrate his skills against volunteer challengers to drum up new student enrollment before the holiday season. It was held not in the dojo itself, but at Rosie's Grill, the largest event space in town, rented out for the evening with folding chairs arranged around a roped-off mat in the center of the dining room. Half the town would be there: parents, students, local reporters covering it for the community paper. It was, Marcus realized, the perfect stage. He signed up as a volunteer challenger under a plain, unassuming name, listing his occupation simply as local resident. Nobody batted an eye. Nobody recognized the name. On the night of the exhibition, Rosie's Grill buzzed with energy. String lights hung along the ceiling, the smell of fried food mixing with nervous excitement in the air. Ethan sat beside Marcus at first, not realizing what his father had planned, until Marcus quietly told him to watch closely and knelt down to look him in the eye. "Whatever happens tonight," Marcus said gently, "I need you to know that strength isn't about making someone else feel small. Real strength protects people. That's the only kind that matters." Ethan nodded, confused but trusting, and took his seat among the other families as his father walked toward the registration table. When Derek Cole took the floor for his final demonstration of the evening, he scanned the small crowd of volunteer challengers with the practiced arrogance of a man who had never once been beaten in his own dojo. His eyes landed on Marcus, an unremarkable man in his late 30s, average height, calm expression, nothing about him suggesting any kind of threat. Cole grinned at the crowd. "Looks like we've got a volunteer tonight who might want to reconsider," he said, drawing a ripple of laughter from the audience. Marcus said nothing. He simply stepped onto the mat, rolled his shoulders once, and settled into a relaxed, grounded stance that most people in the room mistook for nervousness. What followed lasted less than 90 seconds, though it felt to everyone watching like it unfolded in slow motion. Cole opened with a flashy combination meant to impress the crowd more than actually finish the match, the kind of showy strikes he used to intimidate beginners and dazzle spectators. Marcus didn't flinch. He read the telegraphed movement instantly, the same way he'd once read incoming threats in the field, and simply wasn't where the strikes landed. He redirected Cole's momentum with an economy of motion that looked almost gentle, using leverage instead of force, control instead of aggression. Within seconds, Cole found himself off balance. His own momentum turned against him, and before the crowd fully understood what was happening, Marcus had guided him safely but completely to the mat, pinning him with the same calm, controlled precision he'd once used to subdue enemy combatants without a single unnecessary movement. There was no cruelty in it, no showboating, just absolute undeniable control. The room fell silent. Cole, red-faced and stunned, scrambled to his feet, sputtering something about a lucky move, demanding a rematch to save face in front of his students and the reporters scribbling notes nearby. Marcus simply extended a hand to help him up, an act of quiet grace that somehow humiliated Cole more than the takedown itself had. "You don't need to prove anything to me," Marcus said evenly, loud enough for the room to hear. "But you might want to think about what you're proving to the kids who come to you to learn." Someone in the crowd, a local news reporter who had been quietly recording the whole exhibition for a community segment, later confirmed what a few sharp-eyed veterans in the audience had already whispered to each other. The takedown Marcus used wasn't sport karate at all. It was Krav Maga-influenced combatives training, the kind taught almost exclusively in special operations units. Word spread through the room like wildfire. Someone asked Marcus directly if he'd served in the military. He didn't confirm it outright, but he didn't deny it either. He simply looked over at his son, sitting wide-eyed in the crowd, and said quietly, "I used to do a lot of things. Now I just try to raise a good kid." The days that followed changed everything, though not in the way anyone expected. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't do interviews, didn't accept the flood of attention that suddenly came his way once word got around town about who he really was. But the story reached the dojo's other parents fast, and within a week, half of Cole's students had quietly transferred to other academies in the area, their parents no longer willing to trust their children's safety to a man who'd built his reputation on intimidating kids rather than teaching them. Derek Cole, humbled in front of the very community he'd spent years trying to impress, eventually reached out to Marcus directly, showing up unannounced at the garage where Marcus worked. He didn't come to argue. He came awkwardly and with obvious difficulty to apologize, not just to Marcus, but specifically to Ethan, admitting that he'd let his ego get in the way of actually teaching, that he'd forgotten what the sport was supposed to be about somewhere along the way. It wasn't a perfect redemption, and Marcus made it clear he wasn't interested in being anyone's hero or cautionary tale. But he told Cole that if he was serious about doing better, he could start by teaching differently, by protecting the kids who needed protecting, instead of tearing them down. Ethan never went back to Cole's dojo. Instead, months later, Marcus quietly began teaching a small self-defense class at the community center on weekends. Nothing formal, no trophies or flashy commercials. Just a handful of kids who needed to learn that confidence came from control, not cruelty. Ethan stood at the front of that class every Saturday morning, no longer the smallest, quietest kid in the room, but a boy who had watched his father demonstrate, in the space of 90 quiet seconds, that real strength never needs to announce itself. Years later, when people in Millbrook talked about that night at Rosie's Grill, they didn't remember it as the night the local karate champion got beaten. They remembered it as the night they learned that the quietest man in the room is sometimes the one who has already won every fight worth winning and simply chose peace instead until someone gave him a reason not to.